When we talk about animated movies, the mainstream animation fans often forget the 1983 classic Fire and Ice. It was everything that fantasy fandoms could have wanted and directed by none other than Ralph Bakshi. This movie is something of a fan favorite. It was designed with fantasy painter Frank Frazetta, who's a legend in his field. So, with Ralph Bakshi and Frank Frazetta, this movie was supposed to be the definitive animated epic of pulp-era dreams. This movie looked nothing like any cartoon on the market at the time. It was the perfect mix of realism and oil painting aesthetics, but despite that, this film's legacy can be best described as complicated. So you gotta wonder, what happened to Fire and Ice? Let's go back in time and understand the story from the very beginning. Imagine a painting full of brooding glacial death lords, sword-wielding warriors, and jungle princesses. This was the world that Frank Frazetta created on canvas, and Fire and Ice tried to bring that fantasy world to screens. In a way, you could say that this movie was supposed to be a moving tribute to Frazetta's paintings, and frankly, that's all. Now, with what we just said, you might think that Frazetta's name was slapped on just for branding, but that's not the case. In fact, Frazetta was intimately involved with the design, color palette, and direction of the aesthetic tone of the movie. Fire and Ice was a passion project between him and Bakshi, a project that was meant to break the mold of conventional animation. This story was going to be raw and pulpy, and to ensure that was achieved, without all of that typical Disney sheen on the animated movie, they used a technique called rotoscoping. For those who aren't familiar, rotoscoping is a technique where live-action sequences are filmed first, and then they're traced over, frame by frame, to get hyper-realistic human motion. It is technically twice the work because you have to film everything with human actors and then paint over them one frame at a time, but the result of that work is extremely satisfying. Bakshi had used this technique before in The Lord of the Rings from 1978, but in Fire and Ice, he took rotoscoping to a new stylistic extreme. Everything, from actors to stuntmen and dancers, were filmed, and then all artists on board meticulously redrew every frame to create Frazetta's heroic style. Dancing, acting, sword fights, and dramatic gestures, everything you see in the movie was actually shot on sound stages in California. Then, the live-action footage was handed over to a small army of animators and painters. All the shadows and biceps were stylized, contoured, and color graded so they would match the vision they had already set for themselves: mythic realism. This kind of art style made it look like the characters belong in a Conan comic book, and when you watch the movie, that idea is reaffirmed because of how the script goes. The script has some serious comic book DNA in it, and I mean, wouldn't it? The writers behind the script for Fire and Ice were none other than Roy Thomas and Gary Conway, the masterminds behind the Conan the Barbarian comics in the 70s. The entire structure of the movie, the lone hero, the kidnapped princess, the evil sorcerer, and the masked warrior, all follow similar plot beats to Conan's stories. And that's part of what makes this movie so iconic. This was one of those rare fantasy storytelling moments where they didn't want to be highbrow like Tolkien. It was unapologetically pulpy and savage sword of Conan coded. And this wasn't just the case with the story. Even the action of the movie followed the same rule. There were no complex moral dilemmas or political intrigue at play. We just had lava-filled volcanoes and savage battles. Conway and Thomas gave the fans what they craved: sword and sorcery. And Ralph Bakshi did everything in his power to turn that vision into reality with his trademark artistic chaos. But all of those savage tribes and evil warlords weren't the main event of the show. It was the visuals. And of course, how could it not be? The production went all out and gathered an astonishing amount of talent, especially for background artists and layout designers. James Gurney, the guy who created Dinotopia, was one of the creators behind many rich backdrops. Thomas Kincaid, America's famous painter of light, was also a part of that crew. And then there was Peter Chung, working on layouts and animation. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he's the one who went on to create Aeon Flux, the cult classics series. So yeah, in short, Fire and Ice created their very own artistic Avengers team lineup even before that was a thing in mainstream. And these backgrounds, as expected, were more than simple painted scenery. They were panoramic oil paintings. Each piece is moodier than the last. Each one showcases the myth of the world. These backgrounds, behind the rotoscoped characters, did more than just create a pretty space for our characters to exist in. They basically carried the ambiance, which made the story believable. Thanks to the rotoscopy technique, it felt like we were watching sculptors move and act in an artistic fever dream. Everything, from the scene to the characters and their shadows, was tailored to meet the drama you can see in Frazetta's brushstrokes. So one could even go so far as to say that Fire and Ice is one of Frank Frazetta's best paintings. That could explain why when you see Larn, the hero, you can clearly see that he was drawn to look like the cover of the Death Dealer. Similarly, Tigra, the princess, was not animated for agency. She was animated for sensual movement. Darkwolf, the film's savior, is everything Frazetta's character Death Dealer was, and that's why every movement he makes is stylized, heavy, and kinetic. And to accompany these kinds of characters, we got a simple story. However, none of the creators or the characters treated that story casually. There are no winks or hidden fourth wall breaks that you'll only catch when you watch the film for the 15th time. This is a movie with high melodrama, operatic standoffs, and very intense slow-motion tracking shots. The characters are a bit thin, yes, but the tone of the movie is grand. Owing to the animation style and the story quality, you might understand straight away that this movie was for teenage boys who had just finished watching He-Man. This movie had a raw physicality about it that made you, the audience, feel the sweat dripping after each battle, the cold of the ice, and the heat of the fire. While the movie lacks large, complex character arcs, it evokes a mood in the viewers, thanks largely to the unflinching aesthetic that the movie is completely committed to. And that kind of commitment means something. In that era, every animated film was squeaky clean and family-friendly. With Fire and Ice, we were introduced to a fantasy world that was illicit and a little alluring. The allure, of course, came from the fact that the movie looked like something you shouldn't be watching in the first place. Over the years, we've had several retrospective discussions about this film, but all of them agree on one thing. This movie feels like a Frank Frazetta moving sketchbook. It feels like an old pulp magazine, like Creepy or Heavy Metal, simply come to life. And that was the exact feeling that Frazetta and Bakshi were chasing when they created the movies, so for better or for worse, they managed to capture that feeling and put it on screen. And this whole endeavor wasn't cheap at all. The film actually cost around 1.2 mil back in the day. It's a modest sum for an animated movie, but it was a huge investment considering how niche this film was. All of that budget was spent on lavish paintings, rotoscoping, and aligning the real motion with the fantastical backgrounds. So this movie wasn't just a fantasy movie, it was also a tribute to one of the greatest fantasy painters of all time. A love letter to the man and an art gallery in motion. This movie is proof that a film could be a love letter and a painting if the right people worked hard enough. But despite all of that artistic muscle, Fire and Ice stumbled really hard when it tried to do anything else. When you watch the first part of the film, you understand just how much heart and soul the animation team put into the whole world. The paintings, the background, the colors, everything's immaculate. But then, as the film progresses, you realize that it forgot a lot of things along the way. Things like the characters, the stakes, the script, and even the audience. As we mentioned, the plot of the movie was simple, but the plot of the movie was so simple that it was extremely predictable by 1983's standards. It was a laughably archetypal fantasy story, and the whole plot was predictable from the start. You have an evil glacier king named Necron, and he's slowly freezing the world with his dark powers. Then you have Larn, the noble warrior, who looks like he was inspired by Heavy Metal, the magazine, not the music. Larn tries to survive after his village is destroyed, and then he comes across Tigra, the princess who was kidnapped, escaped, and recaptured more times than you can count. And in the midst of this colorful crew, you've got Darkwolf, the masked warrior who was the Deus Ex Machina. Did we leave out some part of the story? Nope, that's it. That's the whole story. No emotional arc, no real conflict. Characters want what they want and they get what they want. They say what they mean and there's almost no good story building. The dialogue is functional but clunky. They get to the point and that's it. Conway and Thomas killed it on Conan, but they ended up losing the audience in the case of Fire and Ice. It feels like they took all the Conan stories that were left on the cutting room floor and patched them together without any nuance. So the story we got is the most basic in every sense. You can literally guess every plot point, and that's the core of the problem. Fire and Ice looked cool and new, but it didn't feel new at all. Regardless of its artistic value, when the story is as straightforward as this, after the awe wears off, it gets really old really quickly. Underneath all that shiny exterior, audiences were getting told the same story they'd been told several times. The very old traditional building blocks for story, with no twists at all. As you might have guessed, critics of the time pounced on this factor immediately. Everyone agreed the animation was beautiful and it received a huge amount of praise, but the storytelling was eviscerated. The plot fails as it's simply full of cliches, and this sentiment is echoed in every review and retrospective. One of the most contentious creative decisions was the portrayal of Tigra. Technically, she's the second lead of the movie. She's the kidnapped princess who managed to escape, survive all the deadly encounters, and navigate the dangerous lands. In theory, she sounds pretty cool, right? But in practice, she's the damsel in distress and not much else. She's always either screaming drowning or dragged by monsters or simply crawling around in the most dysfunctional hiking clothes ever, an animated thong bikini. Frank Frazetta had always tried to capture the sensuality of human form in his art style. One could even go so far as to say that his work celebrated human sensuality. So when it came to Tigra, you would think that we would get someone who is sensual in a way that's satisfying to watch. I mean, think about Jessica Rabbit. She's sensual, but it's celebrated on screen and in the real world too. Everybody knew what Jessica Rabbit was there for, and they loved it. But Tigra came before Jessica Rabbit, and despite equal amounts of sensuality in her, with the plot of the movie and the context of the whole story, her sensuality became the death sentence for the film instead of being a celebratory point. There's no denying that she was sexualized, but then you gotta wonder who the movie was made for. Teenagers came to the film hoping for fantasy and ended up being shocked and uncomfortable with Tigra's sensuality. Parents who wanted to bring their kids to the theaters straight up refused because Tigra was too sexual for younger audiences. And the movie didn't even cater to adults because, sure, the sexualization might have been for them, but the movie's story was nowhere near the complexity that you would expect from an animated film for adults. So of course, even the adults refused to waste their time on this 81-minute film where jiggle physics took more precedence over the plot. So no one could tell who this film was for. It was too sexual for kids, too dumb for adults, and too slow for teens. This sort of problem always happens when a movie tries to serve multiple groups of audiences and fails to satisfy anyone. The movie was supposed to be edgy and mythic, but it ended up alienating everybody. It wasn't completely erotic, but with no mature storytelling, none of the audience stayed interested. The worst part about all of this was that the film was released when the entire cinematic landscape was changing. By the early 1980s, fantasy films were everywhere. Star Wars, Conan the Barbarian, Beastmaster, you name it, you got it. And yeah, this was a bit overwhelming and definitely overcrowded, but there was something going on for all of those movies, and that wasn't working for Fire and Ice. Those movies gave us live-action immersion. Arnold Schwarzenegger crushing his enemies felt pretty real to us, but in comparison, despite its cutting-edge rotoscoping, Fire and Ice still looked like a cartoon. And back then, adults weren't as open to animation as they are right now. So no matter how many breasts and how much bloody action was on the screen, the movie didn't clock as a film for adults. When it was released, it was barely advertised and got very little fanfare. This film was quietly shuffled into theaters, and overall, it made $860,000 on a reported $1.2 million budget. In animation standards, this movie was a modest flop, but for an indie fantasy film, this was a big loss. Looking back on it now, it feels like the film was dumped unceremoniously and failed to make an impact, only to vanish without a mark. And the quiet disappearance of this movie was like a pop culture purgatory. It wasn't bad enough to be mocked, and it wasn't iconic enough to be rediscovered, so this film simply sat on dusty shelves, failing to hold a place like Ralph Bakshi's other films. It was somehow too safe for a scandal, but too shallow for cult status, and too weird for the mainstream. So for years, this movie was known as the Frazetta-looking cartoon. Rotoscoping was groundbreaking as a technique, but it created a strange stiffness. So despite being human-like in movement, all the gestures lacked exaggeration. So Fire and Ice's desire to be bound by realism ended up as a cage. None of the characters emoted beyond basic gestures, and because of that, there was no humor or spark of spontaneity. These characters looked like they belonged in a museum. They were beautiful, but they were untouchable. The characters were art, but that's simply not enough for a movie. Fantasy audiences want more than art. They want story, connection, investment, none of which could be found in Fire and Ice. The film's pacing didn't help either. There are scenes in the movie that feel like they're being dragged on endlessly. The whole plot point of Tigra getting caught and her escaping starts to feel real tiring. After a while, you feel that this movie could be condensed into just 15 minutes, and the director simply padded the rest of the time out. Even Necron starts to feel more like an angry teen with telekinesis because there's nothing more to him than his goal of ruling the world. But why does he want to do that? Who knows? His personality is also annoying, like a bratty, sadistic teen, and he clearly lacks the bite that makes other fantasy villains so iconic. And with paper-thin characters like that, everyone can see that the movie didn't have any soul. So you gotta wonder, where did it go wrong? Was it the over-reliance on animation quality? Or was it a failure to adapt the comic book storytelling to cinematic rhythm? Either way, the movie couldn't be saved. It has a 67% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, while Metacritic gives it a 45 out of 100. This movie has mixed reviews, mostly talking about how it's beautiful but has a dumb story. One particularly biting review on Film Authority described this movie as a movie that wanted to be a painting and forgot its story. While some fans were rather cutthroat about it, others were a lot more forgiving. Over the years, fantasy illustrators and digital painters have talked about how this movie has aged like a fine wine when it comes to its visuals. Despite the plot being paper thin, the artists loved its commitment to the aesthetic, and a lot of people consider this movie to be the gateway that introduced them to Frazetta's original work. But that's not how the general audience felt. In an era where flops could be salvaged through home video or cable reruns, Fire and Ice failed to cash in on that too. Only fans of Bakshi and Frazetta remembered this film, but that's the fun part about passion projects like this. They never truly die. So, over the years, this film gained a peculiar cult legacy. It's not quite beloved, but it's not ridiculed either. It exists in a liminal place where the bold failures become fascinating artifacts. Fantasy collectors, pulp enthusiasts, and animators knew what it was. Fire and Ice was a gorgeous film with a one-dimensional story and an unapologetic sensuality, so sure enough, the movie started getting shared and discussed. For artists, this film became a case study in aesthetic commitment. Many art schools include this movie in their syllabi, especially if they focus on concept art and illustration. Art school students spend hours focusing on the backgrounds and compositions of Fire and Ice to better understand the work done by James Gurney and Thomas Kincaid. The depth, the lighting, and the mood of the background paintings are discussed and dissected to understand how all of those tiny things managed to increase and elevate the simplest of settings. And as the fans grew for this movie, more people came out of the woodworks to defend its slow pacing. They talked about how the movie's lifelike, slow movements are intentional to evoke myth. Honestly, they're not entirely wrong. The movie does feel a lot more hypnotic when you focus on the pacing. The most notable achievement of this film is that it has a significant place in Bakshi's career. This movie was his final, fully animated theatrical feature. Everything after Fire and Ice was different because he changed gears. He started veering towards live-action hybrids like Cool World or television work. Some fans feel like Bakshi created Fire and Ice just to prove that a movie could carry the same emotional and aesthetic weight as Frazetta's paintings. Yeah, it failed commercially, but artistically, it passed with flying colors. But why are we talking about it today? In 2022 and 2023, Dynamite Entertainment announced a prequel comic book series. It was developed by both Bakshi and Frazetta estates and penned by Bill Willingham. These comic books aim to expand the lore of the Fire and Ice universe. They gave us deeper insight into fan-favorite characters and the history behind the elemental war between Fire and Ice. This wasn't a move anybody was expecting, but then again, in hindsight, it kind of made sense. Frazetta's art had a renaissance online. Instagram reels to museum exhibits, everything had Frazetta's name, and the comic world was hungry for something from the 80s, and when the announcements were made, it felt relevant. But that's not where the story ends. For a while, there were whispers about a live-action remake. It was first announced in 2010 by Robert Rodriguez, the director behind Alita Battle Angel and Sin City. He's a Frazetta superfan and acquired the rights to recreate the dreamlike world of the original film, but the development for this movie was hell. Some concept art surfaced in 2011, and we even got a few teasers, but then the project went quiet. As of now, there's been no forward movement, there's just been silence, much like Necron's Ice. But despite the wait, hope remains. The comic books introduced the world of Fire and Ice to a new generation, and in this era of streaming, the most obscure properties are getting reboots. I mean, come on, if we can get a multi-season Lord of the Rings series, then we deserve a Fire and Ice reboot. Marvelous verdict! At the end of the day, you could say that Fire and Ice, much like its name, is a beautiful paradox. It's a cult classic that earned its stripes through perseverance and aesthetic conviction. It was a failure that never faded. It conquered the hearts of those who cared, just not the box office. It has its faults, but I mean, who doesn't? It's a monument to ambition and passion, and in this age, where all films are created because of how much money they can bring in, Fire and Ice remains a reminder of what we can get when two passionate artists join hands to create a masterpiece. That's all we got for you this time, but we want to hear how you guys feel about Fire and Ice in the comments section down below. We're fascinated. Have you ever heard of this movie? Are you interested in seeing it now? Are you excited for a live-action reboot? As always, if you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.